She begged to clean his mansion for a plate of food, but when the CEO saw her, his heart changed forever. The rain fell in heavy sheets, lashing the earth in relentless waves. Thunder cracked in the distance, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to mirror the unease inside Emily's chest. Her soaked hair clung to her face, and her breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as she stood at the imposing gates of Alexander's mansion. Her fingers trembled as they pressed against the cold intercom, a faint glow flickering through the storm. "Please," she whispered, barely audible against the howling wind. Her eyes flickered down to Rosie, wrapped tightly in her arms, the little girl shivering in the damp cold, her small face buried against Emily's chest for warmth. "Please, someone help us." The intercom crackled to life, a crisp, rich voice cutting through the static. "Who is this?" Alexander's voice was deep, authoritative, a stark contrast to Emily's trembling plea. Emily's heart pounded, her voice nearly lost in the wind as she spoke again, louder this time. "My car broke down. We're stuck out here. Please, we need shelter. Just for the night." A silence followed, thick with hesitation, as if the man on the other end of the line was weighing the decision. The wind howled, the storm intensifying, and Emily hugged Rosie tighter, fighting the chill creeping into her bones. "I don't know how much longer we can stay out here," she added, the vulnerability seeping into her tone. After what seemed like an eternity, the gates began to creak open, their metal hinges protesting against the storm's fury. Emily's breath hitched in surprise. She had expected a refusal, not this sudden invitation into the unknown. The gates parted wide enough for her to see the imposing silhouette of the mansion behind them, a fortress of stone and glass standing resolute against the storm. The lights inside flickered, casting an ethereal glow across the front porch. Without a second thought, she stepped forward, her soaked shoes sinking into the muddy driveway, but she didn't care. She was moving toward warmth, toward safety. Rosie's small whimper of discomfort broke Emily's focus. She glanced down at her daughter, her heart aching for the little girl who had no idea what kind of world they had just walked into. They trudged up the long driveway, their steps heavy, the storm's grip relentless, but Emily kept moving, focused on the figure who had just let them in. She couldn't understand why someone so wealthy, so unreachable, would offer help without question, but she didn't have the time to dwell on it now. The warmth of the mansion's entrance was all she could think about. The large wooden door loomed ahead, opening before she even had a chance to knock. A man stood in the doorway, tall, his face shadowed by the dim lighting. He looked down at her and Rosie, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome to come in," he said, his voice clipped but not unkind. "Get inside. It's dangerous out here." With one final look at the storm, Emily stepped over the threshold, leaving the chaos of the night behind. As the door shut softly behind them, she felt the weight of the cold and the storm lift just a little. But the question remained in her mind. Who was this man, and why had he opened his doors to them in the middle of a storm? But in that moment, there was no room for answers. There was only warmth and safety and the soft, steady rhythm of Rosie's breathing as she slowly began to relax in her mother's arms. The grand doors of Alexander's mansion closed quietly behind them, the storm's fury muted as the heavy would seal them off from the chaos outside. Emily stood for a moment in the marble foyer, taking in the towering columns, the polished floors, and the faint smell of wood and leather that seemed to define the place. It was all so foreign, so out of place for someone like her. Rosie tugged gently on her sleeve, her tiny hand trembling in the cold. Emily lowered her gaze to the little girl, trying to reassure her with a soft smile. "We're safe now, Rosie," she murmured, brushing the damp strands of hair from her daughter's face. "Please, make yourselves comfortable." A voice broke through her thoughts. Alexander stood at the far end of the hall, his figure dark and imposing against the soft glow of the chandelier overhead. His eyes, however, were distant, his expression unreadable. Emily nodded, a tight smile forming on her lips. She was grateful, so deeply grateful, But she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time the mansion had seen such a scene. That he had been here before, offering shelter to someone, but never truly engaging. He had let them in, but the walls around him seemed even thicker than the ones outside. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice sincere but uncertain. "You really didn't have to." Alexander raised a hand, silencing her with a gesture. "It's not a problem," he replied quickly, though the lack of warmth in his words made the phrase feel like an obligation rather than an offer. He motioned toward the staircase. "There are fresh clothes upstairs in the guest room. I'll have someone bring you some food." Emily looked over at Rosie, still clinging to her side, and nodded. "Thank you again," she said softly, her gaze flicking to the towering, empty spaces around them. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating, as if both of them knew the other wasn't fully present in the moment. Without another word, Alexander turned and walked down a hallway, disappearing into the shadows of the grand house. Emily hesitated for a second, but then, with Rosie still in her arms, she climbed the stairs. The guest room was exactly as he had described, simple, yet elegant, with a large bed covered in crisp white linens. She set Rosie down gently, watching as the girl crawled onto the bed, her small body curling into a ball, exhausted from the storm. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What was it about Alexander that seemed so distant? There was something about his eyes that had seen too much, been through too much, that made it hard for her to believe the man who had opened his door to them was the same man standing in front of her now. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find a maid, carrying a tray with steaming soup and a stack of neatly folded clothes. "Mr. Alexander asked me to bring these," the maid said, her voice soft and respectful. She set the tray down on the bedside table and turned to leave, but Emily stopped her. Do you know him well?" Emily asked before she could think better of it. The maid paused, glancing back with a small, knowing smile. "Mr. Alexander is a man of few words," she said softly, "but he's always been kind to those in need. Don't let the silence fool you. He cares." With that, the maid turned and left, leaving Emily alone in the room with her thoughts. The food on the tray was warm, comforting, and as she watched Rosie eat, a flicker of peace settled in her chest. But as Emily ate, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around Alexander's heart were just as thick as those of the mansion. She had entered his world, but would she ever truly be welcome in it? The soft click of the door echoed through the study as Alexander stepped inside, the weight of the evening's events settling on his shoulders. His mind had been running in circles, thoughts tangled like the storm outside. He had offered shelter to Emily and Rosie, but something about their presence gnawed at him, a sense of familiarity he couldn't quite place. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Alexander walked toward the desk, his fingers lightly grazing the smooth wood. He had always prided himself on his ability to control his emotions, to keep his past locked away behind carefully constructed walls. Yet tonight, those walls felt thinner than they ever had before. As he sat down, his gaze fell on a small photograph on the desk, one of his daughter, Lily. The young girl's face smiled up at him from the frame, her bright eyes full of life. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to linger on her memory, and yet the image still brought a sharp ache to his chest. His fingers brushed the frame, moving it slightly to the side. A flicker of movement outside the study window caught his eye. It was Emily, standing with Rosie by the garden, the little girl clinging to her mother's side. He could see the faint outline of the bracelet Rosie wore, gleaming in the dim light. It was an odd thing, a simple bracelet with a small silver charm in the shape of a heart. But as Alexander stared at it from across the room, a chill ran through him. He had seen that bracelet before. His heart quickened as memories surfaced of a young girl, full of joy, wearing the same bracelet. Lily. It was Lily's bracelet. He had given it to her years ago on her birthday. She had loved it, often wearing it proudly as she played in the garden, her laughter echoing through the halls of the mansion. The realization hit him with a jolt, and his breath caught in his throat. It was impossible. But there it was, the undeniable similarity between Rosie's bracelet and the one he had given Lily. His hands trembled as he reached for the drawer, pulling it open. Inside was another photograph, this one of Lily wearing the bracelet, a bright smile on her face as she held it up for the camera. He stared at the picture, the weight of grief pressing down on him. Lily had been taken from him too soon, and now, here was Rosie, another child, another girl with the same bracelet, the same innocence. The similarity was too striking to ignore. But what did it mean? Could it be a coincidence, or was there something more? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching the study. He turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her eyes cautious but warm. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. Alexander hesitated for a moment before standing. I think I've seen something that connects us," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily stepped into the room, her expression curious but wary. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the photograph of Lily, then picked up the bracelet from the desk. "This bracelet, it's the same as the one Rosie is wearing," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I gave this to my daughter on her birthday. It's a gift she treasured." Emily's eyes widened in surprise as she looked at the bracelet in Alexander's hand. She opened her mouth to say something but faltered, unsure of how to respond. "Do you think it's a coincidence?" she asked softly, her gaze shifting to Rosie, who was still outside with her mother. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. "I don't know, but I can't ignore the resemblance. It's bringing back memories I've tried to bury." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words. Emily's voice broke through the silence. "Maybe it's a sign that we're meant to be here, to help each other." The words hung in the air, and for the first time that evening, Alexander felt a flicker of connection, something that transcended the walls he had built around himself. It was small, tentative, but it was there. He nodded slowly. "Maybe," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Maybe it is." The weight of the past still loomed over him, but in that moment, he felt something else, a glimmer of hope. Maybe the connection wasn't just in the bracelet. Maybe, just maybe, it was in the people standing before him. The soft hum of the vacuum cleaner was the only sound that filled the grand halls of Alexander's mansion. Emily moved steadily through the rooms, each swipe of the cloth against the polished surfaces a small act of normalcy in the midst of the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She didn't mind the work. It gave her a sense of purpose, a distraction from the weight of uncertainty that lingered in the air. She had expected a cold welcome when Alexander opened his doors to them, but instead, she had been met with silence. The kind of silence that spoke volumes. It was clear that his grief ran deep, and Emily understood that. She knew the feeling of walls being built too high, of keeping people at arm's length to shield oneself from the pain of loss. She had been doing it for years. As she moved from one room to another, Emily couldn't help but notice how every inch of the house seemed to hold memories. Memories of laughter, of life, of a family that once was. The walls were lined with portraits, each one capturing a fleeting moment in time, each one a reminder of what Alexander had lost. Yet, the house felt empty, the stillness palpable, as if the life had been drained from it long ago. She paused by the window, looking out over the manicured gardens. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to part, revealing a sliver of the setting sun. She sighed, then continued her task, dusting the bookshelves in the study. As she worked, she became aware of a quiet presence behind her. Turning, she saw Alexander standing in the doorway, watching her with a gaze that was soft, almost contemplative. "You don't have to do all of this," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I don't mind," she replied. "It helps me feel like I'm not just here, taking up space." There was a pause, and then Alexander stepped into the room, his footsteps measured, like he was testing the ground beneath him. "You're not just taking up space," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something that might have been warmth, or perhaps just fatigue. "I'd appreciate your help. It's just," he trailed off, as if the words didn't quite come out the way he intended. Emily nodded, not pressing him for more. She understood. Some things couldn't be rushed. "I know how it feels to be alone in a house like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. "But you don't have to be alone." Alexander looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment, the walls around him seemed to shift just a little. He exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, almost under his breath. Emily set the dusting cloth down and walked over to him. "None of us did," she said, her voice gentle. "But we have to make the most of what we have. We can't change the past." He didn't respond, but something in his eyes softened, just slightly. He seemed to be considering her words. Meanwhile, Rosie, who had been playing quietly by the window, suddenly dashed across the room toward Alexander. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around his legs, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Alexander froze, his body stiff, but Rosie didn't let go. She simply looked at him with a sort of innocence that only a child could have, her small voice breaking the silence. "Are you my friend?" she asked, her voice sweet and innocent, the simplicity of the question cutting through the tension in the room. For a moment, Alexander didn't know how to respond. His throat tightened, and he looked down at the little girl, her blonde curls framing her face, her tiny hands still gripping his legs. And then something inside him shifted. Slowly, he crouched down to her level, his face softening. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm your friend." Rosie's face broke into a wide smile, and she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Alexander stiffened at first, but then relaxed, his arms slowly encircling her in return. The moment felt fragile, as though it were a tentative bridge between the past and the present, between the grief that had consumed him and the possibility of something new. Emily watched from the corner of the room, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. She had known this would happen, this small connection between Alexander and Rosie. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She could see it now, the flicker of life returning to Alexander's eyes. A glimmer of hope. The cleaning, the small gestures, these were the first steps. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were the beginning of healing. For both of them. The nursery door creaked softly as Emily pushed it open, the quiet hum of the house replaced by the sudden stillness of the room. It was a beautiful space, with soft pastel walls, a crib adorned with delicate white curtains, and shelves lined with toys and books. But there was something about the air in the room, something thick and heavy that made her heart skip a beat. She had only meant to check on Rosie, to ensure she was safe and comfortable. But as her gaze moved across the room, landing on the crib, her breath caught in her throat. A wave of guilt washed over her. She didn't belong here. This wasn't her space. The door behind her swung open, and Alexander stepped into the room. His footsteps were almost inaudible against the soft carpet, but there was no mistaking the tension in his posture. His eyes locked onto her, and she immediately felt the weight of his gaze, like a storm was brewing within him. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, sharp, laced with an edge that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "I'm sorry," Emily said quickly, stepping back toward the door. "I didn't mean to intrude. I thought—" "No," Alexander interrupted, his voice cutting through her words. "You shouldn't be here." His jaw clenched as he moved toward her, his hands tightening at his sides. This is not for you." Emily stood frozen for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest. She had never seen him like this, so raw, so unrestrained. He had always been composed, guarded. But now, the grief in his eyes was unmistakable, a storm cloud gathering behind them. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. Why are you even here?" Alexander's words were a mix of frustration and pain, his eyes flickering between her and the crib, as if the sight of the room itself had opened a wound he thought he had healed. "I don't need your pity, Emily. I don't need anyone here." Emily stepped forward cautiously, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to pity you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. I just wanted to help. I don't understand, but I want to try. I know you're hurting, and I can't just pretend everything is fine. Alexander's expression faltered, his eyes narrowing as if her words had struck a chord deep within him. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to get caught in his throat. Instead, he let out a deep sigh, and for a moment, the anger in his eyes softened. This room, it's all I have left of her, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Lily, she was supposed to be here, growing up in this house, playing in this room. But instead, I'm left with memories, and they haunt me every day. Emily's heart ached as she watched him, her own grief mirroring his. She hadn't known the full depth of his pain, not until now. She had seen the distance in his eyes, the wall he had built around himself, but hearing the words, feeling the weight of his loss, it was something else entirely. I can't, he continued, his voice a mere whisper now. I can't look at this room without feeling like I'm betraying her. Every time I walk in here, I see what's missing. And I can't bear it. Emily took another step toward him, her presence a quiet offering of comfort. You don't have to bear it alone, she said softly. You don't have to hide from it. Alexander looked at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something softer, more vulnerable. The walls he had carefully constructed around his grief were crumbling piece by piece under her steady gaze. She didn't force him to speak. She simply waited, offering him the space to feel whatever it was he needed to feel. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words, shared sorrow, and the understanding that grief could never truly be erased, but could be acknowledged, felt, and shared. Finally, Alexander lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging slightly as the weight of his emotions seemed to settle into his chest. I don't know how to move on, he admitted quietly. I don't know if I can. You don't have to, Emily whispered, her voice barely above a breath. You just have to keep going, one step at a time, and I'll be here, if you want me to be. For the first time since he had opened his door to her, Alexander didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into his isolation. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging the unspoken bond that was beginning to form between them, one built on understanding, not pity. And in that quiet moment, in the nursery where so many memories lingered, Emily realized that she wasn't just offering him comfort. She was offering him a chance to heal. The sound of the gates opening was drowned out by the hum of cameras clicking and microphones extending toward the front door of Alexander's mansion. It was a normal afternoon, or at least it had seemed that way, until the flashing lights and chaos erupted just outside. Emily stood by the window, watching as a throng of journalists gathered in front of the mansion, their eager faces pressed against the iron gates. Their questions were sharp and invasive, floating on the air like arrows, each one designed to tear away the privacy they had fought to protect. Who is she? Why is she here? What's going on inside? The questions rang out, a cacophony of speculation and demand. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had known this would happen, eventually, but she hadn't expected it to be this soon. The moment she had stepped into Alexander's world, she had expected to remain hidden in the shadows. But now, the spotlight was shining directly on her. On them, Rosie, who had been playing with a toy in the corner of the room, looked up, sensing her mother's unease. "What's that noise, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small and innocent. Emily crouched down, her arms wrapping around her daughter, trying to shield her from the chaos outside. "It's nothing, sweetie," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Everything's going to be all right." But the noise outside only grew louder, and soon the door to the study opened. Alexander walked in, his face calm, but his posture rigid, as if he was preparing himself for the battle ahead. His eyes met Emily's, and she could see the storm brewing behind them. He had never been one to show vulnerability, but now there was something different in the way he carried himself. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he wasn't backing away. "We need to face them," he said quietly. There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, only resolve. Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "What are you going to do?" Alexander looked at her, his expression softening, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a man defending his home, but someone who had chosen to stand by her, to protect her and Rosie in a way that meant more than she could fully grasp. "I'm going to do what's right," he said simply. Together, they walked to the front of the mansion, stepping onto the grand porch where the cameras and questions awaited. The media swarmed around them like a hive of bees, their voices a blur of demands for answers. Emily felt exposed, her every move scrutinized, but Alexander stood tall beside her, unflinching. As the questions continued to fly, Alexander stepped forward, raising his hand to silence the crowd. His voice, when it came, was steady and commanding. "Enough," he said. "You want answers? Here they are." He turned to face the reporters directly, his gaze unwavering. "This is Emily, and this is her daughter, Rosie. They're not here for your gossip or your speculations. They are guests in my home, and if you think you have the right to invade their privacy, you are sorely mistaken." His words were sharp, but there was an undeniable strength in them. The reporters paused, caught off guard by his defense. But Alexander wasn't done. He glanced at Emily, his eyes softening ever so slightly before he turned back to the crowd. "I don't owe you any explanations, and neither does she. So, I suggest you leave them be." Now, the tension in the air was thick, but the reporters hesitated, sensing the finality in Alexander's tone. After a moment, they began to disperse, murmurs of disbelief and defeat trailing behind them. Alexander stood firm, his gaze still locked on the retreating figures, until the last reporter had turned and disappeared down the driveway. Emily stood there, her heart racing, still trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he had stood beside her, the way he had so easily defended them both without hesitation. He had done something no one else had done in years. He had protected her. She turned to him, her voice low but full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her throat tight. "I didn't expect." Alexander gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "It was the right thing to do." But to Emily, it meant so much more than that. She had seen him as distant, closed off, a man defined by his grief. But now, she saw something different. She saw a man who was willing to fight for what he cared about, who had opened his heart, even just a little, to her and to Rosie. As they stood there, the weight of the moment sinking in, Emily realized something she hadn't fully acknowledged before. In this chaotic world they were living in, they weren't alone anymore. They had each other. And with that thought, the bond between them grew just a little bit stronger. The soft glow of the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the room as Emily and Alexander sat together on the leather sofa, their eyes locked in a moment of quiet understanding. The house was calm now. No more chaos, no more questions from the outside world. The silence between them wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like the calm that follows a storm. The days had passed slowly since that media frenzy, each one unfolding like a new chapter in a story neither of them had expected. Emily had spent the last few weeks helping around the house, taking care of Rosie and, little by little, earning Alexander's trust. The walls he had so carefully built around himself were slowly crumbling, and though they both carried their scars, they were learning to heal together. "I never thought I'd find peace again." Alexander's voice was soft, almost inaudible, but Emily heard the weight behind his words. He leaned back against the couch, his eyes softening as he glanced toward her. "After everything, I didn't think it was possible. But you and Rosie, you brought something back into this house. Something I thought I'd lost." Emily's heart warmed at the sincerity in his voice. She had seen the guarded man he once was, the man who hid behind walls of grief and anger. But now, there was a gentleness to him, a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. She had seen him open up in ways she hadn't expected, letting her in, letting herself in. "I didn't think I could find love again," she admitted, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Not after everything that happened. But being here, with you and Rosie, it feels like a new beginning, a chance to start over." Alexander turned his head to look at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find the truth in her words. And in that moment, Emily felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. They had both been broken by their pasts, but now, together, they were starting to rebuild. Rosie's laughter echoed from the hallway, followed by the soft sound of her running toward them. Emily and Alexander both smiled as the little girl appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up as she saw them. "Mommy! Daddy!" Rosie's voice was pure joy as she ran into the room, her small hands reaching for them both. Alexander's arms instinctively opened, and Rosie climbed onto his lap, snuggling against him as if she had always belonged there. Emily's heart swelled as she watched the two of them. The connection between Alexander and Rosie had grown steadily over the past weeks, and it was clear now this was her family. She had never imagined this kind of life for herself, but as she looked at them, her heart was full in a way it had never been before. Alexander looked down at Rosie, his expression tender. "You're getting too big for my lap," he teased gently, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "No, I'm not." Rosie giggled, her tiny hands grasping at his fingers. "I'm just getting stronger." Emily couldn't help but laugh at the innocence of the moment. This was the peace they had both longed for, the calm they had fought so hard to find. And it wasn't perfect, no. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. The warmth from the fireplace wrapped around them like a cocoon, and Emily leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, closing her eyes for a moment. She had never imagined a life like this, one that was so full, so rich with love. There were still hard days ahead, moments of doubt and uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face them. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Emily whispered, her voice almost a breath. Alexander nodded, his arms slipping around her as he kissed the top of her head. "We have, and we'll keep going, together." As Rosie continued to chatter about her day, Alexander and Emily shared a quiet glance, an unspoken promise between them. Their future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like something they could face together. There was healing, and there was hope, and with each passing day, their family was growing stronger, finding its place in a world that had once seemed so bleak. In that moment, the future felt bright. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward hand in hand, embracing whatever came next. And that, Emily realized, was enough. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you're watching from and drop your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of Alexander's journey toward healing and how Emily and Rosie brought light into his life? Did their connection surprise you? Share your favorite moments with us, and don't forget to mention the characters, Alexander, Emily, and Rosie, and how their paths intertwined in this emotional journey. We can't wait to hear your thoughts.